This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Right, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce Cathi, the author of 4 novels, 2005's The Not Knowing, 2007's The Singer, 2009's Bad Penny Blues, and last year Weirdo. These are all gripping stories, all exemplary of contemporary noir. And if you don't believe me, believe Ian Sinclair, who wrote about Weirdo, a great page-turning read. The construction is effortlessly managed. I think the whole package works beautifully. Memory traces, bad magic, sounds and smells. Obviously the sounds are going to be the most relevant part of that to us today. Cathy's also edited the anthology London Noir, published in 2006 and featuring contributions from noted crime fiction practitioners Martin Waits, Jules Denby and Ken Bruin.
And musicians.
And musicians, Barry Adamson, who we may hear from later. Before becoming a novelist, Cathi was for many years a music journalist, starting her career as a 19-year-old, working for the long-lamented Sounds magazine, alongside lauded music writers such as John Robb, John Savage, the journalist John Ronson, and some other people not called John. Gary Bushell amongst them.
He wasn't there when I was there.
She went on to work for Melody Maker and at Mute Records on the industry side, before a stint as deputy editor at Bizarre magazine, where, as well as recruiting a host of quite brilliant writers, she covered the literature beat, driving the magazine's coverage of noir fiction. Cathi, it's an absolute joy to have you here.
Thank you very much.
So the way I'd like to structure this is as a kind of invisible jukebox. I've selected a number of tracks that respond to Cathy's work or to that of associated authors, and I'll start each section by playing a track, and then we'll ask Cathi to identify it. If by
He's trying to trick me.
There are a couple of slightly tricksy ones in there. We'll see if
I
we
know
can trip
his
her up.
music taste.
If by any chance she's unable to get any of them, we'll throw it open to the audience and see if you can get them. And then I'll ask Cathi some questions sort of resulting from that piece of music, its relationship to her work, and then hopefully drawing out some broader themes for music and literature more specifically. I've got 12 tracks in total. The first 6 are specifically responsive to Cathy's work, so I'll keep the discussion just here for those 6, but then from then on, assuming we've got time, if we could get questions from the floor as well, that would be really useful. Okay, so without further ado, I think this one will be quite obvious.
Yeah. That's The Killing Me by Echo and the Bunnymen.
So I think we should let it play a little.
Yeah. That's very beautiful.
In the starlit nights I saw you, so cruelly you kissed me. Your lips magic were, your sky all hung with jewels. The killing moon will come too soon.
Right, let's take that one down. So, Echo and the Bunnymen feature very prominently in your most recent novel, Weirdo.
Yes.
And I was, sort of kicked off with the biggest track from that album. And I was wondering if a nice sort of softball question for you, if you could just talk a little bit at what Echo and the Bunnymen do for this book.
Well, the reason that I've got all of Ocean Rain in sequence going through Weirdo is because as I was getting ready to write this book, I knew I was going back to 1984. And it's a weird thing. Some of the stuff from that period I've listened to quite a lot since. So it didn't really trigger the memories. But a friend of mine gave me a remastered CD of Ocean Rain. And when I put it on, it was like the time tunnel opened. I was back in 1984, back in this town in Norfolk where the book is set. I could just remember stuff that I'd forgotten. The synaptic nerve endings had all opened. And I thought, also, every song title on that album had some relevance to what I was writing about. It was I've tried to make Weirdo partly like a fairy tale or a folk tale world, and those song titles are very suggestive of that. And I think, The Killing Mean came out probably in the January, I think, of 1984. I think it was the first single of that album. And for me, it's just memories of being... I used to go to art college on Friday nights after school to do life drawing class because I so desperately wanted to get into art college and not sixth form college. And afterwards used to walk along the beach at night with the deserted funfair in the winter time, and it just reminds me of walking along. And you did see big stars in those Norfolk skies, and like in a snow dome of stars by the sea. So it's sort of quite romantic, but also it's tied in with those teenage feelings of angst and yearning, and and finding your place in the world, which is what Weirdo is sort of all about. Yeah.
So I mean, there's a number of things to kind of pick up on, and some of them we'll come back to, but clearly there's biographical elements here.
Yeah.
Or autobiographical elements. The fairy tale thing is interesting. I'll come back to that as well. But perhaps most of, obviously, this music is a sort of periodizing thing.
Basically, I think you can't embed smells in a book, but smells and sounds are the two things that take you to a place more than anything else. So I always try and embed a soundtrack into my books to give you a feel of the times. And 1984 was a really good year for music. It might have been a terrible year politically, but it was a really good year musically. And I know I set that novel in that era deliberately because I was 15, 16 in those years, and when those teenage feelings never leave you and they come back to you quite powerfully when you've abetted by the tools of the music you were listening to. And it was a very politicised time. A lot of the music in the charts, like New Model Army, they're featured in it quite a lot for a couple of reasons. One, because I love them as well. That Vengeance album said an awful lot about the year of the miners' strike and the spirit of the Falklands that had just gone before, that had helped Margaret Thatcher to stay in power. But they were very political, and they were in the charts and being quite uncompromising. But I also like the fact I've put a bit about the witch hunts that used to take place, and in my hometown there you can still go to this dungeon in the Toll House in Great Yarmouth where Matthew Hopkins tortured witches at the time of the Civil War, and when the actual New Model Army were camped in Yarmouth. So I quite like the idea of all those centuries later, these young goths and punks being into a band called New Model Army. I just like the resonance of that too.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna skip on to something I was gonna play a lot later, because you mentioned politics, and it seems to make sense. To go straight to. This is a Trixie.
I have to say, it doesn't immediately.
It's not from 1984.
Doesn't sound like it.
But you might recognise the lyrics.
I am a product, I am a symbol of endless, hopeless, ruthless, aimless games. I'm a glossy package on the market shelf. My contents aren't fit for human consumption. I'm catastropically injured, your perfect health. My ingredients will cease up your body's function.
A 90s track.
It's even more recent. It's covering someone from
everyone wants
I give up. You got me.
Let's just give him the chorus. That was me. I bumped it up.
I'm a scapegoat, useless, futureless, endless, mindless ideas. I'm a number on the paper, you far away. I'm a portfolio, you stick in the drawer. I'm the fool you try to scare when you say you know all about you.
Dick Kennedy.
Sure, well I don't want your crazy system.
British.
Close. Even closer.
That try to resist them.
No.
Even closer pronunciation. Anyway, okay, we'll throw that one over to the floor.
It's Jeffrey Lewis covering Crass, but I couldn't believe the song.
There you go. Yeah, Jeffrey Lewis covering Crass.
Wow.
Which is, end result is the song. That is a sneaky one. I freely admit that. But I brought that because Crass
are also in there. Yeah.
are in Weirdo, and they are kind of perhaps the most overtly political punk band of that period.
Yeah.
The
most DIY.
Yeah.
Yeah. And our record shop in Norwich Backs, which was the equivalent of Rough Trade, just all covered in Crass posters, all the walls, Christ the album. And I just thought they also have brilliant titles.
Yeah.
You know, and
they had
You're
great...
Already Dead, and
Yeah, they had great iconography as well.
And the fact that you could buy their albums for like £1.50 when all other albums were £5 and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That was
and they did that fantastic. They managed to get the phone recording of Thatcher and Reagan.
That's right,
they did a cut
they?
up.
Yeah.
It made them sound like they were planning to press the button.
And and they had questions asked in Parliament, didn't they? How does it feel to be mother of 1,000 dead? Which I really was hoping they'd re-release that for Tony Blair. How does it feel to be father of, I don't know, 2 million dead? How many people have died because of Tony Blair?
Yeah. So I guess the question would be: do you, is music reference to music a way of kind of getting politics into an otherwise largely apolitical genre? Can I even say that about?
Well, I think that all writing is political to an extent, because that whole punk thing, the personal is the political. And I wanted to show a landscape of 1984 that is not a commonly seen one, because normally we do think of the North and the miners' strike, but while that was going on where I lived, it was like, and I have these little witchy girls in there who are making, like, lighting their candles trying to do protection spells, but meanwhile all around the coast is what I think of as Margaret Thatcher's Black Mass, the oil rigs that are keeping her in power, and they're always sort of winking at the evil characters in the book, sort of acknowledging, kindred spirits there. So I thought it was quite interesting to show that side of what went on in that year. And it's not majorly political, but it is sort of, I want it to be, because I don't really like bashing people over the head with things, but I do like to sort of suggest things. And music, again, it is a brilliant way.
It's a way of getting in there.
Of getting in there.
I mean, to join those sort of two, I suppose, kind of ways of using music reference, I guess we might, call it intertextuality, and you sort of making the reader think about a different text. And I when I was sort of preparing for today, I was thinking that this, and it absolutely has that effect. The Bunnyman stuff for me sort of takes you straight back to that sort of period. But I wonder what how that sort of intertextuality works for. I guess it divides readers. You've got some for whom
some who will know. But I just think, well, if you don't know what it is, you can look it up on Spotify and find some great music that you might really like. So,
everything's kind of always on. So
because I always try and because I did start off writing as a music journalist, and I always try and keep a slight element of plugging stuff I like, music I like and books I like and films I like within my work as well.
Yeah.
So I just think if you're interested in these things in general, you'll be interested in these, And I've always got, like the Cramps. I learnt so much about 50s music from their musical taste, and I think good people like to pass things on and pass it all around. So that's also a side of it too.
Yeah. So it becomes a kind of a network, a path to follow for the reader.
Yeah.
Interesting. Right, we shall go back to the original order. This one, I don't think you'll have any problems with once I can get this back up. Here we go.
I'm not looking.
Here we go. So,
I got a can of beer.
Oh, Derek Raymond. And Callan Drunk.
Kitchen table.
The entire reason that I started doing this.
For mica surface.
Oh,
I took a swallow of the beer.
was this the least
trying to
sweary one you
conceive
could
what's
find?
meant to be murder.
sure.
I tried to imagine Carstairs and Suarez's terror at the killer's sudden eruption into the flat on Saturday night. Until in the end, for an instant, I became Suarez physically as the killer came for her, and felt as paralysed as she did, as the axe bit into her arm at the swinging finish of its parabola. The phone rang again. I picked it up and said, "Yes." The voice said, as if I'd never been away, "There you are. You're back on the police." A14? "Yep." I said, "It isn't to do with the axe murder of those two women over in Kensington at all, Carstairs and Suarez, is it?" The voice said, "It is. What have you heard about it?" I said, "I read about it in the paper tonight, coming back from Brighton." I added, "I'm a private citizen. I don't have to be dead easy about going back to Poland Street just like that." "Yes, you do," said the voice, "so get round here now." "It's not on," I said. "There's the Fox matter, the disciplinary board, all the breakage you get when you try and string me round with a load of cunts." "It's all arranged," the voice said. "The Fox affair's forgotten, because I'm short-handed." "You make me feel really wanted," I said. "Nobody particularly wants you," the voice said. "I need you, there's a difference. So get over to the factory and get your ass in gear. By the way, there's a mate of yours, Sergeant Stevenson, over on A14, who's dealing with another death over at Clapham that happened hardly within an hour of Carstairs Suarez, and he wants to talk to you. You come in now, ask my deputy, DCS Jollo, sign some paper which will give you a warrant card, then get on to Chief Inspector Bowman, serious crimes, he's first on the scene. He'll take you over to Kensington. Also see Stevenson as soon as you can. Now come on, move. I've no one obstinate enough but you to put on this, so hurry. I'm having my wig twisted over this one from upstairs." "Why is that?" I said. "You put your questions to the dead," the voice said. "No point your putting them to me." It rang off.
So, could you just talk a bit about what that is and who
Well,
it is?
that's how I came to be writing books rather than, well, the start of the journey was my favourite band was the Callan Drunk, and in 1992 I think they made an album with this writer Derek Raymond called I Was Dora Suarez, and I'd never heard of Derek Raymond before, and I heard the album, I read the book, and I met him, and it was like the equivalent for me of meeting the crime fiction's Johnny Rotten. He was 63-year-old streak of pure manic energy, a really amazing guy who'd been brought up as an upper-class toff in a castle in Kent and ended up working for Associates of the Cray Twins in 1960s London, and putting his Eton tie to good use fronting long firms for them, and things got a little bit too hot and he skipped across to Italy and became I think it was the foreign secretary for his local anarchist collective, and he moved around the world quite a lot, doing quite a lot of amazing things. He lived in America, he danced on the left bank of Paris with Juliet Greco. He had a really an astounding, amazing life, and he wrote his first novel in 1962, The Crust on Its Uppers, which basically is him working for this guy, Charles De Silva, who he calls something else in the book that I can't quite bring to mind now, but Colonel Bulbul, he calls him. And he was the Indian guy that Robin worked for. And I guess they did a lot of naughty things, and as an older man, he sort of regretted his felt like he had to atone for it, and started writing these amazing series of novels, the Factory series, of which Suarez is one of them. And the reason that I felt so powerfully when I read this book was I used to love Sherlock Holmes when I was little, as most people do, I think. But as an adult, I'd never really read a crime book that moved me in any way, because they were all like crossword puzzles, and you know, I'm not interested in that. But Derek Raymond was writing about the victim of a crime in a really compassionate, amazingly compassionate way. And with this really haunted London landscape, again, a sort of Thatcher's Britain, 80s, crumbling, dirty old London that we would scarcely recognise today. And the character of this detective sergeant he's narrating in that piece, who has just basically doing the jobs that no one else wants, the dead bodies that no one cares about, trying to he's like a sort of avenging angel, a grievous angel hovering above the unwanted people of London, trying to sort of, I guess, give them their meaningless deaths some closure, or I don't know. Anyway, those books I found very moving, and I found amazingly brilliant. Although his books are very bleak, he was a party on two legs. He was somebody that was so fantastic that my friend John Williams, who later became my editor at Surf and Stale, he was very good friends with Robin, and Robin died. I only knew...
So she just clarified that Derek Raymond's a...
Derek Raymond, sorry, his real name was Robin Cook, but he didn't want to have that name because there was two other Robin Cooks. So Derek and Raymond were his two favourite drinking buddies, so he took their names, which is typical of him. And I knew him for 1 year, and I have had a lifetime of magic out of that 1 year.
I've got a quotation here from his memoirs about Dora Suarez. That's quite, I think, speaks a bit of what you've been saying. Writing Suarez broke me. I see that now. I don't mean that it broke me physically or mentally, although it came near to doing both. But it changed me. It separated out forever what was living and what was dead. I realised it was doing so at the time, but not fully, and not how, and not at once. I asked for it though. If you go down into the darkness, you must expect it to leave traces on you coming up, if you do come up. It's like working in a mine. You hope that hands you can't see know what you're doing and will pull you through. I know I wondered halfway through Suarez if I would get through. I mean, if my reason would get through. For the trouble with an experience like Suarez is that you become what you're writing, passing like Alice through the language into the situation. So I guess I was wanting to then sort of focus that onto thinking about genre. And I mean, I guess you would see yourself as working very specifically within a generic form.
Yeah, I think the noir genre, because I mean Robin separated them into entertainments and noirs, and the noir was the one where you could ask the serious questions, and there was nothing entertaining about it. Although there is quite a lot of black humour in those books, which obviously is realistic because policemen, people working, undertakers, pathologists, all the people working in those worlds have to have a necessary sort of streak of dark humour to be able to do their jobs, I think. But yeah.
So, what would you see? So, is that the defining characteristic of the form of noir that distinguishes it from other sort of generic?
I think it's sort of asking, I don't want to sound too pretentious, but it's asking bigger questions about good and evil. Why are we here? If we live in a supposedly richer, more stable world than ever before, why does this keep going on? Why does this never end? And for me, it's also, why is there such a gulf between men and women? Why don't men and women, it's not just why don't different sections of society get on, it's why don't essentially men and women, why is there that? Because I think that's the root of noir, really.
So it's kind of sort of very, very kind of black and white Manichean kind of.
Well, it's also like injustice. I always start my books really from feeling angry about something, and whether it's violent teenagers growing up in violent and neglected circumstances like Weirdo, or whether it's the series of murders that I wrote about in Bad Penny Blues. It always starts from a point of something being quite unjust and wanting to look into that and do something. It's exactly the same way as Derek Raymond saw a picture of a dead girl, a real true crime picture of a dead girl with a scimitar through her, and wanted to write her story for her. And that's when he wrote Dora Suarez. It always starts from a point like that, I think.
It's interesting. I mean, so could you have a sort of accidental noir? I mean, what I'm wondering is, are the sort of defining characteristics of this genre, are they intrinsic or extrinsic? I mean, can other people decide that something is noir, or does it have to be the...
I don't think it has to be too rigid. I mean,
Yeah.
I quite like genres blurring in and out of each other, and I've done a little bit of that myself, because I just don't ever, want to keep writing the same thing. And I think where murder and that is concerned, there's always going to be elements of ghost story, horror story, the stuff that we just don't know, because we just don't know what happens. And so it's quite interesting to have a bit of that in there as well. But I think basically the difference between what I would call a noir book and a straight crime book is that a noir book's not going to be about glorifying the police, saying how great they are in some way. It's not going to be like an isolated incident within a community. It's going to relate to society as a whole thing. It's like a way of looking at society through a crime. As quite a lot of people that I admire often said, you get the crimes you deserve, you get the police you deserve. And yeah, so I think that a noir novel would have more a sociological impact, and it would be less, I don't know, less an entertainment, I suppose.
Yeah.
A crossword puzzle, something that's neatly resolved at the end, and then everyone gets up, and then there's another 30 books with the same copper going through the same shit, and none of it affects him in any way, which I do find very unrealistic.
Well, we'll come back to the sort of realism thing later, but let's pick up on the sort of supernatural there, and that will take us neatly on to the next track. Now I've got a really tricky one, or I've got a sort of more obvious one, so let's give you the obvious one.
Just lure me into a false sense of security, why don't you? This is Joe Meek. And that the honeycombs have either right.
Very good.
But the unique and spooky sound of Mr. Meek.
I'm going to skip it on to the tricky one. This is Joe himself at home. I think you've probably got this.
Yeah, this is on our Here a New World, I think. You can tell it's him because there's just that spooked out sound to everything he does.
Carry on.
There's a spooked out sound to everything Joe does, isn't there?
Yeah.
And
So tell us a bit about Joe Meek.
so Joe Meek entered my world when I wrote Bad Penny Blues, slightly by accident actually, but nonetheless, this was a spooky old book to write. It was inspired by reading a book called Jack of Jumps by David Seabrook, which was about these unsolved murders of prostitutes that happened in West London between 1959 and 1965, and a very bizarre case it was, because there was 8 people murdered, but in a strange time frame that in 1 year there was 4. It started with one person in 1959, then there was another in 1963, then there was 4 in 1964, then there was 1 in 1965, and then it all ended, and no one was ever apprehended. And it had been the biggest manhunt in the Metropolitan Police's history up until that time. But yes, this figure, Jack the Stripper, they called him, because he left the women naked. He'd strangled them all with their stockings, and he'd left them in these strange patterns. Some of them were on each side of the Thames, virtually opposite each other. Some of them were floating down the Thames between the spots. So it had all these strange sort of occult-y angles that you could read into it. And you could also read into the fact that the killers always seem to be one step ahead of the police, and that all the true crime books that have investigated it don't really seem to offer a solution that I found particularly plausible. But what really got me about Jack of Jumps was that I hadn't realised, I've lived in Ladbroke Grove since 1987. Nearly all these girls lived or worked in Ladbroke Grove, which at the time was the biggest red light district in London, which is quite hard to believe now that it's, you know, full of bankers and rich people, but it was very down and dirty in that time. And so these streets that I'd spent 25 years walking up and down were the streets that these women had spent their very short, brutal, nasty lives walking up and down. And there was pictures of them in Seabrook's book where they all look about 40, 50 years old, and they're all 21, 22. So, you know, they've all had these really hard, nasty lives. And everything that's been written about them since has just been basically, including David Seabrook's book, they're dirty slags and they deserved it. And I just thought they don't deserve this. I felt I would like to do something better for them than this.
So how do you go about that? How do you?
I was kind of like looking into the period, which was the most interesting period. Obviously, just the period just before you're born. Maybe it's the same for everybody. It's a more interesting era. That sort of, and for me, the late 50s, early 60s, before it all goes into colour. It's like that black and white world. It was a really interesting time. It was the time when the sort of baby boom post-war grammar school kids were going to come up and take charge of the entertainment industry. But it hadn't quite happened yet. The Beatles hadn't quite happened. They were sort of on the horizon. But there was a really interesting art scene in Ladbroke Grove at the time. It was all, what's his name? Peter Blake was at the Royal College of Art, and David Hockney was there, and Derek Bosher was there, and this wonderful girl called Pauline Boty, who only lived to be 26. Pauline sort of became one of the characters in my book accidentally as well, because I'd started writing about an art student who was actually inspired by the quite silly 1959 film Beat Girl, which nonetheless had an interesting point. That Beat Girl, who looks like Bridget Bardot and is very pouty, her dad is an architect and he's building this horrible concrete City 2000 while living in a mansion in Kensington. So I thought that's a really interesting aspect of that era, that the post-war building boom, when they weren't actually just putting new houses up over bomb sites, they were just knocking down whatever they wanted. And you could read into it, and separating communities where they were unhappy that certain people were mixing freely, and trying to separate people and put them into their little rabbit hutch blocks to live in. So a really interesting time of social change, a bit like the time of punk, when you had skiffle bands rather than punk bands, but the same premise. Yeah, here's a washboard, here's a dustbin, go form a band. So a nascent, very exciting music scene, which Joe Meek was part of. And the reason that Joe, sorry, long convoluted story, but the reason that Joe connected with the murders was the first woman who got murdered was last seen in Holland Park, outside the tube station at about 2 o'clock in the morning. Right opposite where there's a place called Lansdowne Studios, and if anyone's familiar with that area, it's all very big stucco mansions, but Lansdowne Studios is an even taller building which looks like a castle, and it was the Victorian Artist Studios, but at that time it had become a music studio, and Joe was in there. He was working on this jazz label, and he produced the single Bad Penny Blues by Humphrey Lyttelton, and he engineered it in a way that Humphrey Lyttelton was profoundly unhappy about, because he wanted it to sound like 30s Louis Armstrong, but instead he made it sound like something else completely that was later copied, I think, by Paul McCartney. Lady Madonna and Bad Penny Blues sound pretty similar, and got Humphrey in the charts, so Humphrey had to agree that Joe did something right. So Joe was working in this strange tower-like building. Joe was obsessed with the occult. He did seances, and songs came to him in seances. He was also obsessed with radios, taking them apart and getting strange new sounds out of them, which all sort of merged in my head with this track that Mark's just played off this really bizarre album called I Hear a New World that he was secretly making when he was in Lansdowne Studios. And he was also at the time living in Ladbroke Grove, that's the other thing. He lived on a road in Ladbroke Grove where I used to live, and I didn't realise this. He had a boyfriend that he lived with, and he was producing bands in Arundel Gardens as well. Interestingly enough, Behind a Green Door, which a very suggestive song of that time, which is still there. So I had the idea that Joe, doing his strange mixes, making his strange worlds into the night, and somehow opened this channel through which Jack the stripper, the phantom killer, came. And this girl's walking around outside, the killer is driving up in the car, Joe's strange music is spooling out. And then I have this girl in the book called Stella, who has the dream that she is this girl, and the spooky music's going on in her head. And when she wakes up, it's coming through her wall, because Joe and his boyfriend are living next door, playing back the music he's made. And somehow she's picked up on it. Because I had to find a way of telling these girls' stories. What was important was the last few moments of their life should be seen to be, you know, everything that went through their minds, the full horror of it, but without them seeing them getting killed. Because I didn't really want to give the killer any kind of kudos at all. It was them that was important. So I had to find this way of, they're all very different, fit in their last thoughts. And it was like it was channeled through Stella, which was my conceit that I thought everyone, you know, it might be laughed out of town, but I just could not find a better way of.
Well, no, it's interesting. I mean, I think there's precedent for that sort of strategy. Toni Morrison in Beloved, sort of, you know, she shifts into a supernatural register, and you know, we could read this as a way of dealing with the kind of incommensurate trauma of the sort of events of slavery, and you know, so I think supernatural is kind of like we can read it as a sort of tried and tested strategy for dealing with traumatic events in a kind of literary way without actually describing, you know, trying to recapitulate those traumas. And
I really like the idea of the wireless coming into this as well, because the wireless was invented by a spiritualist, Oliver Lodge, and it was a bit like that thing that you used to be obsessed with, trying to the ghost sounds on them. And so it's basically the spiritualists thought that the ether was the thing that surrounded us all, and when you die you just pass on to a different wavelength, you see, and if you can switch the dial around to the wavelength that the dead person is on, and so this is why the wireless was invented, and Joe Meek was obviously into these things, but he's also into just creating bizarre sound effects that, you know, he had a mixing desk built for him by people at EMI that they couldn't understand it. But he was a genius as well. Well as.
Well, the you know, history of media is also the history of talking to the dead. Okay, well, let's jump on to track number 4. Okay, this one's going to be a doddle for you.
The ace.
.2 minutes, in, out, don't overstay
Job
your welcome.
done.
Anyone else know what that is? Yeah, that's Cathi.
It's The Damned, and it's a love song.
Yeah.
Although it sounds remarkably similar to the Ace of Spades by Motorhead at the beginning as well, doesn't it? They were friends, weren't they?
Lemmy played for a brief while, did he not?
Yeah, I
The
think they
Damned?
all did interchange,
Right.
because The Damned had about 1 million lineups and 1 million farewell tours. Yeah. I mean, so, yeah.
I suppose I should qualify also. This is a panel on literature and pop, and I've kind of marooned us in sort of 79, 80, 80
No, we
at
just
the
had
moment,
a
but-
whole 1959 interlude
that's
there
right,
with Joe.
yeah, we did go
So there
back
we
a bit,
go.
and we will go forward a bit as well. So
Not too forward.
so The Damned, I played that because there's a scene in your second novel, The Singer,
Where they go to a damned...
where they go to a
Their
damned
first
concert.
farewell concert at the Rainbow, which
Right.
handily for me, my friend Richard, who I used to work with on Sounds, and he now, like me, works for Take a Break magazine, the Arlington House of Music Journalism. He was at that gig, and he wrote up for his school magazine, so I had a full match report that I could weave into the story. But I wanted The Damned to be included in this thing, set in the sort of punk, post-punk time, because I love The Damned, and they never get mentioned. It's always the Pistols and the Clash.
Yeah.
You know,
To what extent do you think that's to do with Captain Sensible's novelty single?
It might have a lot to do with Captain Sensible's novelty single and
Yeah.
his penchant for getting naked and rolling around on stage.
Yeah.
But, you know, the New Rose, the Damned first single, was the first punk single. And when I worked at Sounds, my news editor, Hugh Fielder, who had been there at the time, proudly told me how they got this single in, and they thought, right, we haven't got anything better than this. We haven't got an interview, but this is the best thing we're going to hear all week. They put them on the front cover.
Wow.
And that's how Sounds streaked ahead of the other two music mags with punk, because over at Melody Maker, I think Caroline Coombe was trying to tell the editors there that she'd seen the Sex Pistols and the Clash, and they were like, oh, you're just a girl, yeah, what do you know? Another one of the subtexts in this thing there. And they were still sticking to ELP and stuff like that, so that's how Sounds was able to steal the march on punk.
Yeah. Was Sounds a more sort of, do you think it was a more kind of like inclusive environment? Was
Yeah,
it?
well, it was when I worked there. It was half male, half female staff when I worked there.
Yeah.
I think at the time, I don't know because I obviously wasn't there in those days, but I think it always was a bit more working class as well.
Yeah.
I
And
think.
did you also get the jump on Manchester with John Robb?
John Robb was there. And also John Robb did the first interview with Nirvana, which is not often recognised. We were there with grunge first. That was quite an amusing thing for me, that Melody Maker and the Enemy were then really scared that punk would happen again, and it did. And Sounds had grunge first, but then Sounds got closed down, and so Melody Maker then took all the credit for...
Yeah. So how did you feel going to Melody Maker?
Well, I was very grateful that they gave me a job, and it was the Stud Brothers, who were really good people, that got me in there, who liked similar sort of music to me. And I was also very grateful that I did get to Melody Maker's travel bureau for the first 3 years that I was there, and got to go to America all the time to do all the bands that no one else was interested in, who were... But Melody Maker wasn't the same as Sound. It was very... The writers, they were very much more interested in their own egos than writing about music.
Right.
That was the main difference. The pure love of music wasn't there. The first time I was in there, somebody came around saying, oh, PR's rung up, if you go and review their band tonight, they give you 50 quid. And I thought, this wasn't what it was like on Sound. And there was lots of little, obviously eager, starving freelancers going, yeah, all right, I'll go. But I just thought, this is terrible.
Yeah, shattering dreams.
Yes. Absolutely, yeah.
Well, but maybe we'll come back to the sort of music press, its relationship with literature, maybe a bit later. But let's skip on to this track, which now, I'll be interested to see. Cathi will know it straight away, but I'll be interested if anyone from the audience knows this talk.
I feel good, I feel bad, ain't it sad? One day it's all gonna end up in flames, without a shame, 'cause I'm here to change the total course of the world. That's what I'm singing.
Okay, does that?
It's Barry Adamson, but I can't remember
Good
which
man.
one.
It's what
It's
it means.
What it means, yeah. From As Above, So Below,
yeah.
1998.
That's our bizarre record,
It
isn't
is,
it?
yeah,
Because
it
we
is.
used to listen to it bizarre all the time.
So tell us about Barry. Who is he? What's his musical background first of all, and how does he relate to your work?
Okay, Barry was in Magazine, who were probably the most interesting post-punk band, actually, I think. There was about 3 geniuses in that band: Howard Devoto, Barry Adamson and John McGeoch. Dave Formula pretty close behind, the keyboard maestro with the Starship Enterprise, who actually was in Northern Soul bands. He was a bit older than the rest of them. And then he was in Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, and he was in, I think, about the first 3 or 4 albums. More, if there's more Nick Cave fans out here, they can say up till the first Born is Dead anyway. And then he left and pursued a solo career, and Barry was obsessed with the cinema, and his idea was that he wanted to write soundtracks, and no one was going to commission him, he thought, from his punk rock background, so he would invent a film and write a soundtrack for it. And he made this album in 1987 called Moss Side Story. He's got a really great way of punning around with things, and Moss Side is where he's from, in Manchester. And I thought it was the most fantastic thing that I'd heard at that point, and I went to interview Barry about it, and his whole idea of imaginary soundtracks, and got on pretty well with Barry, and eventually ended up working for him for a year, in which time I got my education in film soundtracks from him, because he'd studied them, and now I guess I've seen more of the films than I had then that have inspired him, and now I can see the little bits and pieces where he took from In Cold Blood by Quincy Jones was a massive influence on him. Elmer Bernstein, The Man with the Golden Arm, which was his first single, that he did a stonking version of that, which was a bit of a little mea culpa, because he'd been a heroin user up until then. And
there's a literary reference there, right? The Man with the Golden Arm.
Yeah, it's Nelson Algren's fantastic book. Yeah.
Maybe there's a couple of things I want to ask about there. One was having worked with you for 5 years in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s. I'm struck how I recognise characters in your novels from time to time. There was a sort of cameo of Joe McNally, who's someone we worked with in the most recent one. Would it be? I wonder, might there be a version of Barry in The Singer? Is there a bit?
Well, there is a character who's a bit like Barry, but he's also based on a couple of other people. And interesting enough, one of them was just somebody. The Singer is a large part of it set in Hull, which is where my husband's from. And my husband was in bands when he was young, and he said there was what the coolest guy in his school was this black guy who played bass, and he was in this band. And he was the only black guy in the whole school, which is the same situation with Linton in The Singer. And I later met a guy called Dominic Milne, who'd been in a band with the cool black bass player in Hull. And he read the thing and said, "How did you know this was my life story that you wrote?" So it's a weird thing, although you get elements from people. There's always somebody else who's got quite a similar story, I think. So,
That's interesting. Well, that kind of takes on, because the next time I was going to ask about the sort of discussion, literature as a form from which it's possible to comment on, on real life, actual people and actual events, the Romain Clay, and to what extent you deliberately do that, and to what extent it just happens.
A lot of things just happen. The best things just happen. My favourite character in The Singer was this woman called Donna, who I had not planned to write. And I just started writing a scene, and it was like she barged her way through to the front of the scene. She's the one that at the Damned gig, she's there because she wants Dave Vanian for herself. And I really felt I didn't invent this woman, and yet she's the key to the whole story. So things like that. I mean, other things that swirls around because you live with things for so many years, and eventually it filters through you. But you do meet similar types of people, and I'm quite interested. Another obsession of mine is put a psychopath in a room and see how they'll just disrupt everything, and see how far that stretches out. And obviously they don't have to be psychopaths in the killing business. And the entertainment world is a great place for them to thrive because they have the ruthlessness to get through. So the horrible... There are two singers in this thing. One is the man, one is the woman. The man's the sort of iconic one. But he is replicated over and over again in the history of rock and roll, I think.
Yeah. Well, I'm conscious that we're being recorded, so I won't say anything more. I'm just going to play the next track. And with apologies for those of a nervous disposition.
It was back in 32 when times were hard. He had a Colt 45 and a deck of
Brilliant, isn't it?
cards. He wore ragtop shoes and an old Stetson hat. Had a 2840, had payments on that. His woman threw him out in the ice and the snow, and she told him never ever come back no more. So he walked through the rain and he walked through the mud till he came to a place called the Bucket of Blood. He said, Mr. Motherfucker, you know who I am. And the barkeeper said, no, and I don't give a good goddamn. To Stagger Lee. He said, well, bartender, it's a plain to see. I'm the bad motherfucker called Stagger Lee. Mr. Stagger Lee. Well, the barkeeper said, yeah, I heard your name down the way, and I collect motherfucking asses like you every day. Mr. Stagger Lee. Well, those are the last words of the barkeep said, 'cause Stag put 4 holes in his motherfucking head. Just then in came a broad called Nellie Brown, known to make more money than any bitch in town. Hitching up her skirt over to Stagger Lee. She's starting to flirt. Oh, Stagger Lee. She saw the barkeep, said, oh God, he can't be dead. Stag said, well, just count the holes in the motherfucker's head. She said, you ain't look like you're scoring quite a time. Wanna come to my bed? It won't cost you a dime. Mr. Stagger Lee. But there's something that I have to say before you begin. You have to be gone before Mom and Billy Dilly comes in. Mr. Stagger Lee. I'll stay here till Billy Dilly comes in till time comes to pass. And furthermore, fuck Billy Dilly in his motherfucking ass, said Stagger Lee. I'll crawl over 50 good pussies just to get to one fat boy's asshole, said Stagger Lee. Just then Billy rolls in, he says you must be the man motherfucker called Stagger Lee. I'm Stagger Lee. Yeah, I'm Stagger Lee, and you better get down on your knees and suck my dick, because if you don't, you're gonna be dead, said Stagger Lee. Oh well, Billy dropped down and dropped it on his head, and Stag filled him full of lead. Oh yeah.
get that down there.
If you were a horror director, you would want Blixa Bargeld to do
Yeah, I was gonna
screams for
say.
you, wouldn't you?
Blixa Bargeld, that sort of taut sort of funk there. I mean, that's amazing. So, does anyone in the audience recognise that? Tony again.
Nick Cave,
Yeah.
his version of Stagger Leap and Murderer.
Yeah, right. So is before we get on to Nick Cave himself, is that noir or is that?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's an old folk song. It's an old American folk song, sometimes called Stacker Leaves, that he's obviously customised and adapted. And the line that I think we laughed the most about when we used to listen to this was the "I'll crawl across 50 good pussies just to get to one fat boy's asshole," which is actually appropriated from another song, 2 Times Slim by 2 Times Slim, which is on some obscure old blues album that sort of Ace reissued, I think, and in that period that he probably heard.
Yeah.
Thought, that's a good line, I love that.
Yeah. So sort of borrowing in the folk tradition.
Yes.
But, yeah.
And it's quite gothic, isn't it? It's quite Grand Guignol. It's quite I mean, Nick Cave has created a fantastic world, and it's quite interesting. I don't know if any of you have been watching Peaky Blinders, because it starts with Red Right Hand from that same era, which I think is my favourite era of Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. Actually,
Sort of very tight sound, sort of quite a lot of room in.
Very funky at that point as well. Actually, Martin Casey's bass is very funky.
I mean, Cave himself is a sort of very interesting artist. I mean, that's a narrative, right?
Yeah.
And this is someone who, despite doubtlessly, problematic. I mean, he got a real shoeing, probably completely justifiably, from Nina Power in The Wire last year for misogyny. He, an interesting artist. He is also a successful novelist and a screenwriter.
Yeah.
So I guess there's. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that, sort of maybe the parallel between songwriting and the sort of narrative elements that are shared.
Yeah, I mean, when you think of really good songwriters like Tom Waits or Shane MacGowan, somebody who's like telling you a whole brilliant story in a song, it's much harder to do that, I think, than to write a novel, because you've only got so many lines, and obviously you can make it slightly more dynamic, but it is a fine art. And I think obviously Nick Cave is very seriously into his literature, and you can see that he's read Nelson Algren comprehensively, and Cormac McCarthy figures quite strongly in his repertoire.
Yeah, the soundtrack, the film of the road, didn't it?
Yeah, but I also think the song Red Right Hand it's the plot of No Country for Old Men, isn't it? And when you see that film and the guy appears at the end and he gives them, the little boys, what they want. Here's the devil, isn't he, blowing through the dusty land. And
he does. I mean, he does a good devil. Hold on, I've got a picture of him.
Oh,
yeah. So that was Joe Meek.
Mickey.
There's the Damned. There's Barry,
Buzzer.
looking very
looking
Superfly.
quite Isaac Hayes there.
Yeah.
You just can't see his horns, but maybe if you were a child, you could see them protruding. Yeah.
So, okay. Well, look, let's skip on from something quite savage to something kind of altogether more beautiful. Now, this one's a tricksy one, but again, it's sort of going at the same thing. I won't play the whole thing. Oh, sorry, I've turned the sound right now.
Cocktail Twins.
Close. But you got there straight away, essentially. shame not to.
Oh,
play
that's
that
beautiful.
out.
Is it Liz Fraser with Jeff Buckley?
Very good. Well, yeah, excellent.
What voices? Angelic
amazing.
voices.
Amazing. Yeah. All flowers in time bend towards the sun.
Beautiful.
So that was. I played that again because of the singer. Now I know that's it's a bit of a. I was talking with Tony about this the other day. No, and it is. Is it fair to say that in the singer you have a kind of ethereal?
I have a sort of Liz Fraser voiced woman. But she kind of looks more. Actually, she doesn't look at all like her. But that was the kind of sort of dreamy, floaty music that I had in mind, and she was a bit like what's her name, Julianne Reagan, a bit more, which was maybe a bit more mainstream than the Cocteau Twins, but somewhere in the middle of those. This woman who could express so much when you couldn't even understand what she was singing about, but that her voice was so amazing it would take you somewhere on a journey. Yeah, and that was an early 80s thing.
Yeah.
When I
sort of 4AD sort of.
Yeah, very 4AD. You can imagine the blurry front cover with maybe a little bit of light squiggle from a long overexposed frame.
And then they signed the Pixies.
Hats off.
Good move.
But I really wanted to try and recreate that sort of early 80s post-punk vibe, and I just mentioned John Peel's Festive 50, something that you'd really look forward to. I did write extensive biographies for both the bands that I invented, and my favourite ever compliment that I got from this thing was that somebody wrote, I started looking for it on YouTube before I realised it was all completely made up. But yeah.
So what people were searching for the band to see if they could find the songs.
Yeah.
Nice.
So obviously there are a lot of elements of bands that really did exist, but that whole feel of that time.
So in intertextual terms, what does that kind of do for you, for your characters, do you think? I mean I know what I suppose what I'm saying is I think that you kind of you can indicate a sort of mood or sound. And it then kind of gives, this is quite a sort of fragile, ethereal sound, and those characteristics then kind of...
Yeah, well, she was a fragile person in the book, and she had this thing that called synesthesia, which apparently Tanya Donnelly of the Throwing Meteors has that. Right. But I'd only just heard about that when I was writing the book, and there was a really interesting programme about it, and I thought, oh God, that's amazing. Maybe that, if you could see colours, sounds as colours, what sort of music would you write? And so I gave her that gift. Yeah. And of course everyone laughed at her. It was like, oh, and as I've noticed people laughing at Tanya Donnelly, oh, you hippie, you're just making that fairy stuff up. And, basically the thing was mainly, I guess, not mainly, but a lot of it was to show how casually sexist the music business is and how women really just don't matter. They're just there to make the tea. And the men will always stick by each other. Yeah. No matter what. And I had a male music journalist, a lot of girls said, why didn't you have a women music journalist? And it's simply because she never would have got through the door with those guys. They wouldn't have let her into their world. Right. But if you have a male music journalist who is a little bit sensitive, he just gets to hear the casual sexism of everyday music biz conversation. And is told this woman was nothing but a groupie, and gradually discovers that actually she wasn't, and she actually sold twice as many records as the guy she married, and could have had a better life if she hadn't have met him. But because she took their hero away from them, she's being vilified ever since. So.
That one, that one's that is a sort of music business novel. Really, it's about...
Yeah, I did work in that world for a long time, and I guess the themes were going around in my head from very many years before I wrote it, because that was the easiest book to write. It just came out in one... And hardly any rewriting needed to be done on that book. So...
And how, I guess I would like to push a bit at the sort of relationship between, coming from a sort of journalism background and then writing fiction. This is, and again, I've been sort of pushing that bit with the sort of characters. You're sort of taking elements of characters and kind of mixing them together. To what extent is, how do you this relationship with realism and
Well,
how would you kind of define it?
you can always tell when somebody who doesn't know that world has written about it, because it's always the evil manager. You know, everyone is a stereotype. And I just wanted to show it's, you know, it's slightly more realistic how people are in this world. And also how different it was. I mean, I heard a Billy Bragg doing that lecture last year for Six Music about how the music industry has changed in his lifetime. And the thing that I would like to celebrate about that late 80s time was, again, like the late 50s, that young working class people could just pick up an instrument, do it. They didn't have to have Simon Cowell, and they didn't, you know, they didn't have stylists, they didn't have, you know, it was wide open and the music business hadn't caught up with it. And so from that brief period of time, I've got friends of mine who would have been pipe fitter welders or worked down shipyards and mines. They actually got to have a really interesting life because of punk rock. So that was the thing to celebrate about that time. And the thing that I'm coming back to about Billy Bragg is that he said now the young working class kids aren't in the charts, it's all middle class kids who are in the charts. And a lot of the time they think you do have to have Simon Cowell. And there is none of that DIY.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, because I'm an old git, and there could be lots of brilliant DIY things going on around the periphery, but that is a pretty sad fact that all these Brit school kids are running the charts now.
Yeah. It certainly doesn't seem to, while DIY happens, it doesn't seem to kind of get to the...
And it's because everything can be everywhere now, so
yeah,
you can't secretly work on a little cool look anymore, can you? Because it's all over the world within seconds.
Yeah, and it's striking the kind of sort of people that end up on something like X Factor, and you kind of think, well, you know, if you just went and listened to some interesting records and didn't go to Simon Cowell.
I know, why don't just do your own? And why people need stylists? God, why? Anyway.
Yeah.
So, I think it was necessary to have worked within that world to tell that story. But essentially, it is, I guess it's got the same themes as all of the others. It's people feeling different, not fitting in, the music business enabling them to get somewhere, and then their dreams taken from them, because always the most interesting bits in stories of bands, I think, is the beginning and the end. So I've just had the beginning and the end of both these bands. Yeah. Because it's the brilliant, hopeful, fantastic bit when the bands get out of their, you know, one band gets out of Hull and the other band sort of emerging between two lonely Scotsmen and a lonely American girl, and they make a brilliant thing, and it's all going so well, and then it all crashes down at the end. Yeah. And yeah, you know, you have to say there was that there is shitloads of drugs and nasty people in the music business that will cause that to happen.
Yeah. And therefore a good environment for a crime story.
And yeah, and therefore the people who operate manipulating all those people, taking those young people and taking their dreams and messing with them mercilessly and remorselessly and just leaving them trampled underfoot, that's a good environment for them. Yeah. Probably second only to politics, isn't it? Yeah. Right.
Well, we've done quite a lot of talking about sort of content, level of content, so I'd like to think a little bit about sort of form, and so I'll play this one, and also to open it up a bit more as well, and sort of think about writers, kind of that I kind of perceive as sort of, you know, working, you know, in a similar vein or alongside you, or that I know that you read. So I won't play this one for very long. I tried to choose something that was reasonably. Oh, wrong one, but we'll let this play.
I've got to run away, I've got to get away from the pain you drive into the heartbeat. The love we share seems to go nowhere, and our love's not right. For I toss and turn, I can't sleep at night. But sorry to you, now I run from you. I give you all the girl can give you. Take, not give, and that's not living. Oh, tiny love.
lovely flower she's got in her hair.
I know you hurt me so. If I do not pack my things and go, take it love, oh, take it love, take it love, oh, take it love.
Okay, well, I think everyone know the song. I really like that picture. Someone's put
That's fantastic, isn't it?
put soft cell in her hair, soft cell in your bonnet. So yeah, that's Gloria Jones. Who do you think of when I play that? Do you think of any other writers, or do you?
Tainted Love, well, Stuart Home did the book
Right,
Tainted
okay.
Love, set in a similar elaborate grave of bent coppers where his actual mother, who he never actually knew, he was adopted, but his mother had been working in a very bad Penny-esque world in Ladbroke Grave in the 60s.
Yeah, and he's so Stuart Home. I guess he's also. I mean, kind of initially in the track list, this came after the Crass cover.
Right.
So I want to have the two covers and to have that sort of cover. You know, Stuart Home comes out of punk rock.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
What is he? I mean,
It's hard to say, isn't it? I like his own description, which is an ordinary man possessed of extraordinary abilities.
that's quite happy with that. I
He
guess.
does look. He's the only person I know that should read you an entire book that he'd read without referring to it. He's
Right.
got it all up in his head, and he can just remember everything. His books are very. They mix up in music, don't they? Situationism,
Yeah.
other people's work, just generally mucking around in a punk rock way.
Yeah.
But he's extremely hilariously funny, and that's what.
That's what carries it.
That's
on.
what. Yeah. That's the coherence with Stuart. Yeah.
So he sort of borrows these samples from, you know, kind of.
He samples other people's writing, basically.
He was part of a kind of, you know, active sort of plagiarism movement, and borrowed heavily, you know, and would plagiarise criticism as well, critical theory, and sort of mix this all up with pulp narratives, but then more recently he's kind of got more interested in music, I guess. I mean, although he always came from punk and was in punk bands.
Yeah, he's always chucked bits of music into his books. I mean, I think there's 69 Things to Do with a Dead Princess. It's got a whole section on it about rare groove and soul, which you could build a really good record collection around from that alone.
Yeah.
So it's just, he's an interesting. And the last time I saw Stuart, he had a ventriloquist puppet of a dog that was doing his readings for him.
Right.
That he said Ken Campbell had taught him how to do it. There you go.
So, 69 Things to Do with the Dead Princess was a sort of response to Anne Quinn's novel Berg, where Anne Quinn's she was a kind of, what was she, like an early postmodernist, late modernist, who wrote a couple of books, and there's one about a puppet, very strange book, and he was responding to that. So obviously he's taken the puppet idea and run with it.
He has.
Yeah, intriguing. Okay, I mean, does anyone? I'm wondering, Joe. I mean, I'm sorry to single you out. Just that. I mean, is Stuart Home? Does he kind of feature in the sort of canon of like modern and contemporary literature at all? Is he seen? You know, does he?
He might do for some people.
No. Yeah, it doesn't sort of register.
I haven't read it.
No. I mean, it's interesting because he's one of those. I mean, I kind of encountered him. So quite a sort of exciting and kind of energetic.
He is,
sort of, right. Form, and it's interesting whether he hasn't he's never had a sort of commercial sort of success really.
But it's interesting that those people on the sort of periphery who weren't crime writers, Derek Raymond hung around more with people like that, and Ian Sinclair and Chris Pettit.
Yeah.
Than with any other crime writers, because I don't think he liked any other crime writers all that much, actually.
Yeah.
But he was interested in these people with strange ideas.
Yes.
And obsessions, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Intriguing. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. Hopefully this will be...
I do want a little soft cell thing to go in my hair now. This is definitely one of yours, not one of mine. Although it's got a quite Joe Meekish vibe to it.
Yeah. I mean, I guess they would almost certainly listen to it.
This sounds like Art of Noise or something. So
it's a bit sort of rougher, similar sort of period.
It sounds like the arcade, the seafront arcades. That's what it sounds like to me.
So yeah, this is definitely pop in the loosest sense of definition.
Is this one of yours, Mark?
Does anyone recognise that at all? Right. So, very close to Throbbing Gristle.
Way.
Dead on arrival. So when we emailed in advance of this, we were kind of talking about how music could also be informative particularly at the sort of level of rhythm. And you mentioned Throbbing Gristle in relation to
David Peace. I was thinking specifically of the track they did called Very Friendly, which is about the Morse murders.
Okay.
And it's quite an astonishing, and that has that haunted feel that David Peace's work has got.
Yeah.
I remember an early review of David Peace by somebody who really hated him, saying this is like being locked in a room and forced to listen to Throbbing Gristle. I think that's actually really a good compliment.
Some people would like that.
Yeah. If at least he had the taste to say Throbbing Gristle. If it said you'd be locked in a room and listen to Jazz Bunny or something, that would be the end. But you could put that on a press release, couldn't you? Happily, like Swans used to put the most disgusting oral pornography I've ever heard on their press releases. So.
And Peace kind of came up. He's Sheffield. He's grown up Sheffield in the 80s. He was in bands. Yeah,
he was a drummer, I think.
Right.
Because when he talks, when he does the reading, it's very sort of jazz-tastic the way he talks. It's always got a great rhythm to it.
Yeah.
And he said that he reads everything out until he's really happy. Yeah. He won't commit it to the finished version until it can be read perfectly.
Yes.
Rhythmically. And you can tell when he does the reading. So that much work has gone into it.
Yeah. It's clearly, stylistically, obviously, it's frequently described as repetitive, but it seems to me more kind of incantatory.
Yeah, exactly.
It's sort of hypnotic style because you just get the phrases repeating and repeating.
Yeah,
so,
I would agree with you.
So it can, that I guess, rhythm and sound can inform at that level. I mean, do you find that with your work? Do you write listening to music?
Well, the first book I wrote, the first chapter of the first book, I couldn't stop listening to one of Barry Adamson's tracks, which was on the first track of Moss Eye's story on the other side of relaxation, it's called, and it's footsteps going down a road. It's got sort of the sounds of cars going past, and it ends with Diamanda Glass screaming. And it was this really scary, sinister piece of music. And it took me ages to write this chapter because it was the first chapter of the first book, and I had to listen to it all the time. And eventually I read it back to that track, and it takes exactly the same time to read aloud as that piece of music lasts. So I guess that had a strange effect. But the other most brilliant thing about that was Barry read the book and liked it so few. So then I told him, if he'd said bollocks, I wouldn't have. But I told him that I had choreographed my first chapter to his song, and he went, those footsteps. And the first chapter is set as a guy walking down York Way by King's Cross Station in the middle of the night, because at that time York Way was a pretty scary place, and I thought it was the scariest street you could walk down at 4 a.m. And Barry said, those footsteps are me walking down York Way, because I thought the same. So it's not only was it, it was the right location.
Oh right, you didn't know it was.
I didn't know that was him walking. He taped himself walking down the same road that I was writing about. There you go.
So there's direct rhythm.
Yeah. But I think, music can really help you, because you want to have a rhythm to the words. It makes it nicer to read, doesn't it? Yeah.
And I guess there's, I don't know, but I seem to recall from long ago doing modern and contemporary MA that there is criticism about sort of jazz and modernism, right? But I'll leave that off. Maybe we could throw that one open to the floor later, because
you don't like Dave Brubeck, man.
Well, I think at the level of content, you have the sort of obvious, Fitzgerald writing with jazz the jazz age as a sort of
yeah, I
scene.
see what you mean, yeah.
But at the sort of more, again, sort of rhythmic level, I wonder if there's any criticism.
Well, the Wasteland is the biggest example, isn't it? That's Shakespearean rag, which that whole section is based on jazz. And in 1922, that and Ulysses were considered to be jazz writing by some people.
Yeah.
So you're right. I think that's true about jazz and modern, and then much more broadly, it's like Harlem Renaissance and Black American modernism.
Yeah.
We'll take that a lot further, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got kind of like established criticism on that to go to. Okay, now the next one. This should be a crowd pleaser, hopefully. Pleases me anyway.
God, that means it could be anything.
When the volume's up.
It's at VVV. Nothing to be ashamed of there, Mark. No, nothing to be ashamed of. It's brilliant. That's so evocative, isn't it?
Isn't it?
That is early 80s, new towns, underpasses.
Yeah, well, there you go, John Fox, Underpass, right? I mean, it sounds almost the same,
yeah. That is so evocative to me.
The humanoid.
Yeah, and how scary Tube Army were when I first saw them on Top of the Pops. And I just thought they lived in the tube station, or they lived underground, that's why they were Tube Army.
Yeah.
And they were all dressed in black.
Yeah, they look the part. Kind of part of the reason I sort of played that is because it seems to speak of the sort of reciprocity of pop and literature, because these guys were, like Tube Army, John Fox, Cabaret Voltaire. They were all reading Ballard and Burroughs
and Clockwork Orange
and
as well. How many
bands
in A Clockwork Orange took their name from A Clockwork Orange?
Right. So there's a sort of a very sort of specific period, and they're all responding to. I mean, got a track Joy Division called Interzone. Name a track.
The whole of Mute Records is Crash by J.G. Ballard. That's the whole start of a record company, isn't it? Yeah, exactly.
I guess the point that I was wanting to sort of open up a bit more there was just that the reciprocity and the fact that pop music, particularly in that period, sort of responding to literature and certain sort of forms of literature. And I wonder if that was, maybe you could speak a bit about, I don't know, maybe goth's relationship with romanticism or something like that. I mean, it's a sort of.
Well, I think that when I was writing this thing, when I read Rip It Up and Start Again by Simon Reynolds that had just come out, and one of the things that really struck me about that book was how everyone read so much in those days and passed around novels, and novels were really important. And now, when those riots happened a couple of years ago, the only safe place to be was in the middle of Waterstones. Books ain't even worth burning anymore. That's what really sort of upsets me. That at that time there was. People who were making music were reading a lot of books. And I also saw once a very interesting talk, Vivienne Westwood. I didn't see her do it live, but my friend Roger, who owns the Horse Hospital, runs this brilliant art space. The first thing he ever did there was, because he used to work with Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood, was invited them to come and speak about his collection of clothes that he had from all their shops. And they had at that point not spoken to each other for about 15 years, and he managed to get them in the same room and talking using the clothes, and it started off Talkie Malky taking the credit for everything and me. And she just waited for him to like run out of steam before she said a few interesting words, much more interesting words, which was that she considered punk to be the last threatening art movement, the last movement that mattered because the establishment were so afraid of it, and that we live in a culture now that fetishizes youth, and youth is young people haven't had their ideas properly formed yet. They're much more easily led. So take away books from them, take away there being any kudos or anything interesting attached to reading books or being interested in literature in any form, and which I think, you know, the safe zone of Waterstones, it kind of is a bit symbolic of that, and that was quite an interesting thing that she said there. She said if you want to put a dangerous idea out there, put it in a book, because no one's watching what's going in books anymore. So, yeah.
Well, on that sort of dystopian note.
Quite sad. That's quite sad note, but yeah.
Well, I've monopolised Cathi long enough, so let's just, if anyone out in the audience has any questions, please chuck them forwards. You know, do have some more tracks. Maybe we could put on the remainder of the tracks and drink some wine.
We could do that. We've earned it, I think.
Just to rewind back to Stuart Ho. I just wondered if you could say something about psychogeography. It seems to be quite an important thing, especially when you're speaking about West London.
Yeah.
So that seems to be an area that's not usually covered by, you know, the pretty much all male psychogeographers.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting thing, because obviously, and when I met Raymond, was also very interested in Sinclair and the people, they all seem to be part of the same little package. But in my own books, I didn't really know I was trying to do psychogeography until I had written 3 books set in the same place, and realised that the buildings and the things that had happened in this landscape were forming my sort of parallel universe of Ladbroke Grove, and that it was getting really interesting how it was coming true that the same things were happening in the same places. And the Joe Meek thing was the one that really was quite mind-blowing for me, because I had written this. My first book was basically, the idea behind it was a psycho in the killing business meets a psycho in the entertainment business, and this film director and this killer go head-to-head, and the film director is pastiching the 60s, the time of the Cray twins, and I set the novel as which is the most like what my life used to be, as I gave the heroine a basement flat in a disgusting basement flat in Arundel Gardens, which was the flat where I used to live. And then when I started writing Bad Penny Blues, I found that Joe Meek had lived 3 doors down from that, and that the pub that I used to drink in all the time was the pub that everyone used to go to in the 50s, the Earl of Lonsdale, when I first went there, but it was Henneke's, which was the most interesting Portobello pub. And I've since met people who worked there in the 50s and 60s and used to serve John Wayne, and you know, film stars used to come into there all the time. And there's I found some really great old films with Henneke sort of in them. So the more you find out about these places, and then you just meet other people who are obsessed with this little patch of land as you are, like Tom Vague.
I was going to say, there is a West London psychogeographer. Tom Vague did a series of kind of pamphlets, didn't he?
He did, and they're very useful, because the thing is with Tom Vague, which is quite interesting, he doesn't really check out his sources all the time. If he hears something interesting, he'll write it down. So, which is quite good, because then urban myth gets woven into the truth, and that's kind of what I was playing around with in Bad Penny Blues as well, because there was some urban myths about who Jack the Stripper might have been, one of whom was that he was the boxer Freddie Mills, and that Freddie Mills was secretly gay and having an affair with the singer Michael Halliday, and I wove that. And that's something that I used to once work in a drinking club in Soho, and people would still talk about Michael Halliday and Freddie Mills.
Right, who are they? Soho gangsters?
No, Freddie Mills was a really successful boxer. He went
Yeah.
on to have an entertainment career, and he was on TV. The only surviving episode of 6'5" Special with Jimmy Young, or 6'3" Special? You know, there's the one episode that is left has got Freddie Mills and Michael Holiday in it. And they're just dancing around. I think there's a little bit of Freddie Mills introducing somebody. He was a bit of a showbiz legend. And he opened had a Chinese restaurant in, what's it called? God, I'm sorry, Minette Street, round the back of, anyway, he had a restaurant in Soho. And he ended up dead in a car, parked outside his restaurant, with the shotgun neatly beside him. And he managed to shoot himself twice on the head and put the shotgun back beside him, and the police said it was suicide, case closed. So there's lots of weirdness swirling around Freddie Mills, and I think somebody wrote a book saying that he was Jack the Stripper, and I don't think he was, but I'm quite interested to weave that into, because I do like the idea of urban myths, and as well as, you know, when creating a sort of parallel universe, which I try to do.
Yeah.
Because I can't say, so I can't write factual books, because
Yeah, that's a sort of distancing yourself from the...
Yeah, because it isn't the same world, and these people were, you know, these similar people were in it, but they interacted in different ways, and that was just my way of trying to make sense of the strange things that occurred in that period. So Freddie Mills is Teddy Hill somewhere, but...
I saw what you did.
So see what I did there? Yeah.
Anyone?
Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering about, so the music that we've seen went up to 98, I think.
Yeah.
Is there anything which we can find sort of in contemporary pop that yields a noir sentiment somehow? And I suppose pop in the sense of chart music.
Chart music, that's a tough one, isn't it? I mean, I'm really quite rubbish at contemporary music. I got really into a modern band, but don't sound all that modern, North Sea Radio Orchestra, when I was writing Weirdo, because they had a strange, and also because they were friends with Cardiacs, a deeply unpopular band that I love very much, and they had a, and also I'm very much into a band who do exist now, but they are about my age, so I don't think it counts as modern music, called the Caesareans, who are an amazing string. They've got their own, it's kind of like a bit Weimar Republic. It's quite, they've got a brass section, it's quite brass heavy as well. It's really interesting. They're a really interesting band, and they've got a great website, and a really fantastic singer, and it's just a good mishmash. They're quite noir-y. You would have them on a noir soundtrack. But I guess I don't know. I have to admit I'm rubbishly out of touch with. And sometimes I watch Jules Holland and see something I like, but most of the time I just scream at it. Like, why isn't there anything good on here? Oh, there is. It's Tony Joe White. He's not about 90. You know what I mean? Or it's some older person that is good on there. Sorry, I am.
And unfortunately, later with Jules Holland is sort of high caliber.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is what other music shows are there. He just seems to control everything, and I think that's another problem with the music industry now, because the same old gits have been in charge of it since punk, and they ain't letting go, and it's a jealously guarded little kingdom that they want all for themselves, and they don't want anyone young snapping at their heels.
I mean, I did have something sort of lined up to play later. I'll just play a quick snippet, and because I mean, it's again coming from a kind of slightly different tradition, so well, very different. But see if anyone recognises it. Quite recent-ish, 5 years, 6 years ago.
This is your music.
I know. But there is a reason. She's singing about a novel. Is that what she's saying? Could it be a novel? Could it be?
So I misheard that.
No.
Reminds me a bit of Massive Attack.
Yeah, well, yeah, not a million miles away, definitely. Anyone, any guesses?
Burial.
It is Burial, yeah. And the reason I played that was because people are kind of writing sort of pop music critics, or music critics, I guess, writing quite a lot about the idea of music being kind of haunted by sort of earlier forms, and Burial would be a sort of key figure in that, because they sort of say this is a music that's haunted by the idea of rave, and it's just sort of reliving a sort of different version of rave. And I suppose the reason I kind of mention that in connection with this is that there's also a lot of attention on people who are kind of trying to remake and are very interested in weird fiction, so kind of ghost fiction from the ghost fiction and weird fiction from the sort of early 20th century, sort of pulp fictions, and sort of associate this sort of with a kind of forgotten 80s synth sound.
So I was very goth is steampunk now, isn't it? So that's a similar thing, isn't it?
Yeah. What do you think about the idea? I mean, it's interesting because it kind of, there's some of the criticism of this kind of idea. People say, well, the people who've come up with this idea are just getting old, and nothing's as good as what they had.
Well, I think that's a large part of all of us, isn't it? I mean, when you played that Gary Newman track, I hadn't heard that for ages. That immediately brought me back to being about 11 years old and what I felt at the time. So obviously, if you have those associations with that sort of music, and you, as a young person who's 11 years old now and heard that, would have no association, so that would be a clean slate, a new world.
Yes.
It's only us old gits that have heard the stuff that came before that are then layering.
Yes.
And is there any music that isn't a repetition of music that's come? I mean, just the thing I think about music art, everything that requires imagination and it's like a massive Persian carpet floating in the sky that goes on forever, and everyone adds their little threads and picks up from where someone left off, and that's how I think of all art, really.
Yeah, well, this is a kind of, there's this lengthy kind of critical tradition of that. I mean, so Tom McCarthy's essay last year, riffing on Eliot, tradition and the individual talent, and McCarthy had transmission and the individual remix. And it was just riffing on kind of Eliot's idea, but adding in McCarthy style, chucking in a bit of Roland Barthes, and so think that it is a continuum, it's a flux, and we're all the art flows through us. The artist is but a vehicle.
Sure, you have to mention Jonathan Lethem.
Right.
Yes, it's been like haunting the whole session. Right?
Okay, come on then, let's have it.
Well, just in terms of talking about intertextuality, when you were talking about writing these fictional sort of discographies and thinking about what a band actually was and having someone go online and look for their music, and Jonathan Lethem has said the same thing, that there's a lot of musicians that appear in his work, some real, some not, and that he gets tons of people writing to him going, I couldn't find anything by this person. Well, no, why would you? And in terms of that kind of reciprocity, the sense of Jonathan Lethem is also a kind of neighbourhood writer in some weird ways. So first when he's in California, and then when he's back in New York where he grew up, and there's that same way of making that home place strange through genre mostly, and that seemed to connect with what you're talking, the way you talk about your work.
Oh, interesting. I've only read one book by him, which is the one with the guy with Tourette's.
Yeah.
And I must admit, and when I read that, I thought, I think I might have Tourette's, because I, some of the things that go through my head.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a really good book, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, because of that, and that's like quite noirish.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I should probably read more. The trouble is, like, because I got about 3 jobs at the moment, and only one of them is writing books, unfortunately. And I'm trying to write another period novel set in the 40s. For about the past year, I've read nothing but stuff about this particular period in the 1940s, which is that that kind of messes up with you discovering new things. But then again, I do like being obsessive about. So, and that's a really good period for music, the swing era.
Right.
Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Mills Brothers. Oh God, it's so brilliant. I could just listen to that all the time now. Well, in fact, I do. I don't listen to modern music now.
This is a bit later, but you might.
Oh, see, there you go. That's beautiful.
It's about the drumming as well.
This is really similar to the Elmer Bernstein soundtrack, The Man with the Golden Arm and The Sweet Smell of Success, isn't it?
To do this sort of Algren connection, because this is Gene.
Gene Creeper, okay, yeah.
So, because that's again The Man with the Golden Arm.
Yeah. And he was the band that the early skiffler rock and rollers, Gene Creeper was their hero that they modelled themselves on.
Amazing drummer.
Yeah. Great name as well.
Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah. Mark, going back to you talked about Tubeway Army. And you talked about music of that era and others, and the literary connection and the fact that, let's say, punk, post-punk, maybe you call it electro, pop, or whatever, also having connection with J.G. Ballard, for instance.
Right.
Yeah? And you know, we think of Crash, High Rise, I don't know, 70s Ballard, etc. And William Burroughs, etc. I agree with all of that, and I think it's quite good, quite interesting. But that all seems to me also to point to a limit that to a certain extent, and I also agree very much about this point that in that era there was a lot of reading going, a lot of literacy, much more than in a lot of subsequent music on the face of it. But there still seems to be a kind of limit and a fixation on things like Ballard, especially, perhaps Burroughs, certain other things. And you think, well, yeah, that's a good, but why don't musicians read Jane Austen? Or George Eliot, or even Virginia Woolf, or Emily Dickinson, or you know, Shakespeare or John Donne. Well, I can't think of a song about John Donne off the top of my head, but you know, this sort of fixation on a certain modern kind of counterculture tradition of literature is good, but it's actually a very small part of literature, isn't it?
Yes. Well, that's why I was wondering, because I think, you know, some of the kind of goth bands were more interested in the romantic poets and Byron, and it was a sort of, you know, old, and the decadence, right? I mean, so that there is a sort of access.
Can you point to examples of that?
No. I didn't listen to a lot of
Andrew Eldritch wrote brilliant lyrics. I think they still hold up quite well today, because I had another Sisters binge when I was writing Weirdo, and I found that his lyrics actually even sounded even more.
Yeah. And was he reading this kind of? I don't know where
I've got no idea what he was reading, and I have a terrible feeling that he might have been reading J.G. Ballard as well.
You could only buy New Worlds in newsagents back then. Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I mean,
surely John Betjeman has inspired a few things.
Yeah, surely Morrissey was reading.
Alan
and.
Yeah.
Was he? I don't know.
Where's the evidence for that?
I don't know. I'm asking you. I've listened to a lot of.
Well, I think Betjeman recorded a couple of albums.
He did, didn't he? Yeah.
And I was thinking Morrissey. I can't remember.
One song.
Yeah, but just to pick it, a non-countercultural.
Yeah.
I mean, it was definitely a scene thing, right? I mean, that sort of particular kind of urban post-punk sound was interested in that, and then these things do tend to be quite scene-based.
Something that hasn't quite been mentioned, which is possible to argue, is perhaps music journalism affected music that way, and it was a two-way street.
It could well have been,
Paul Wiley is the obvious example, that he was working in a bookshop in about 1977 or something when he first, wrote a faint review of the Buzzcocks or whatever, and he was sitting in the back room reading Ballard, Burroughs, Beckett, Roland Barthes, Angela Carter all the time. And so I think that in that time, around 1980 or so, I think the post-punk time, I think that music journalism became incredibly literate, didn't it? And
yes, it did.
Vast articles.
I used to have to get the dictionary out, honestly, because I had a pretty rubbish education. I can't understand what they were going on about, but it was quite good finding these new words. And
I think they educated a readership, but I think they also educated musicians probably to some extent. And it may have fed into the music through music journalism. And music journalism had a quite, great vocation.
Well, I can tell you, one of the most literate to genius level musicians I've ever met is Lydia Lunch. she's told me once that she, in a Russian translation of her book, what's it called? The one that's basically her life story, Paradoxia. She mentioned reading Kraft Ebing when she was 13, and the translator would put a little star next to this, and then at the bottom of the page, a footnote, I find this very hard to believe. So, there we have again, women, you can't do that. And yeah, I mean, I've seen her doing fantastic talks about other writers like Herbert Hunker and why he was the pivotal beat and the others just copied him, and and Charles Bukowski and how she feels like a 40-year-old man trapped forever above a neon sign on a Hollywood boulevard.
Right. So I mean, were the American beats maybe more important for? I mean, so that we're talking. I mean, this sort of the synth pop thing, very kind of parochially British based. Were the American sort of punks and post punks more interested in the beats?
Well, yeah, Patti Smith obviously was, wasn't she, and Lydia was, and they. But then my favourite American punk band, The Remains, is just pure bubblegum. I mean, the reason I love The Remains is because I think they sound like one of Phil Spector's girl bands. Joey Remains sounds like a girl singer to me. It's just hilarious that he was 6'9" or whatever. Yeah. But yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right that there's certain people who had the platform to say it that's what I mean. I still think it's sad that those same people are still in control of most of what gets sent our way,
People from the punk era.
People from that punk era, they haven't burnt out and left a good-looking corpse, have they? They're still fucking, Jules Holland gets to decide what music we listen to on TV, and we have to bow down to Bob Geldof, Saint Bob, not because he made any good music ever, but because he did so much for charity. And there really does seem to be this establishment of people now from that time who do control a lot of what. And it's also interesting, sorry to interrupt you there, but history is always written by the victors, isn't it? And Paul Morley's from the winning team. Sorry, what you were going to say?
No, I was just thinking that in terms of thinking about it through modes of production, I mean, you were sort of talking earlier about DIY culture and the kind of the X Factor takeover of a particular chart aspect, but actually, certainly in the UK and to an extent in the US, the alternative music that is filtered into chart music is mostly dance music and urban music.
Yeah.
And that, in part, perhaps one of the reasons that takes over is you can't be a musician. I mean, this middle class thing you were talking about. The musicians are middle class because you can't afford to be a musician. There's no dole. There's no option for you. You have a job and then you fit music around it. If you don't get a break, then you're not a musician. Now, but if you're an electronic musician and you're DJing, then that's a really much easier way to make money as a musician. So I think there's a way in which dance music, urban music has a hold on culture that perhaps punk did when it first came up, because that's a more agile platform. That it can do something quicker.
I mean, this is the interesting thing about writing historical stuff as well, is seeing how time works in a loop, because you could almost make a case that Simon Cowell is basically Larry Parnes, but to the power of a million. Larry Parnes used to have all those nice little clean-cut boys that he groomed, and I mean that in every sense of the word, himself, and presented nice clean-cut songs, family-friendly, but meanwhile the undercurrent of skiffle was coming, which was based on black American music, was coming to blow that all away. And so maybe that is like a parallel situation, and maybe Simon Cowell's days are numbered.
No, I wonder if, what you're saying, Joe's saying about the writing, that whether that kind of music writing does take place just online.
Yeah.
There's a sort of digital, it's at a different level. I mean, there is definitely, intelligent music criticism out there, and interesting, is frequently concerned with electronic music.
When dubstep came through, she was here. She was a student here, Melissa's.
Oh yeah, Bradshaw.
Yeah, and she wrote this amazing piece on like the first night at Mass, or one of the early nights, and she'd gone, and it'd been her first time then she kind of writes on the movement sort of afterwards. But and I mean that was in The Wire.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and that seemed to inspire some whole other music journalism which I hadn't read for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
As when I was a teenager, and yeah, and I think that that's there, and you have people like Steve Gilman, and you have people writing around burial, although they get quite cliquey. But certainly in general, I think what Reed's doing, and there's people that.
Yeah. There's an attempt at sort of making a new canon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's got to be the young people are in the moment writing about the stuff that really means that to them.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why we want that. You don't want Paul Morley to be talking about this. But you don't want him to be. You don't want him to find out about it and start going on about it on the late review.
For Arcade Fire a couple of years ago. Do you remember?
God, what a boring band now.
Really
Jesus Christ.
We should probably.
Sorry.
Because then we can have a quick drink before we get asked to leave here. So I just want to say thank you to Cathi very much and to Mark, and please join us for some wine, and maybe we'll go for a drink afterwards if everyone's free to stick around. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. My pleasure.